At our FRSA conferences, we take great care to invite speakers who are world leaders and thought provokers. Before morning tea, we heard from Minister Landry, who holds great influence within the Federal Parliament on the Commonwealth Government decisions being made, on policies influencing children, families, and broader communities. Following the Minister, we had two outstanding international speakers who have challenged us to push boundaries, perhaps even be courageous in our thinking, and to be creative in our pursuit of change for children, families, and communities. Now, we probably need to bring things a little closer to home. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our next guest speaker, Barry Sandison. Barry is the CEO of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and he will build on this morning's thinking about data and the role it plays in shaping the decisions we make in our service delivery. And having worked for many years with the Department of Social Services and the Department of Human Services, he knows a thing or two about our sector. Now at the AIHW, Barry has carriage of an organisation that has a key role and function in producing authoritative and accessible information to inform and support better policy and service delivery. This independent statutory agency holds a significant role in helping us shape policy and future service delivery decisions. Their work helps our work. Now, prior to this, Barry was a Deputy Chief Executive in Centrelink and held senior executive roles for the Department of Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. Barry holds a Bachelor of Business Management and is a board chair for L'Arche Genesare, an ACT community organisation. It's providing supported accommodation for people with intellectual disabilities. We're privileged to have Barry here with us today, discussing the importance of better decisions through better data. Please join me in welcoming Barry.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And then I need to say, in the guide today, it did say originally that I'd be teasing you with data for 75 minutes. Just to reassure you, that's not going to happen. I think actually the word you used, Michael, was titillation several times. So I don't know that data and titillation go together. So what I'm going to do is probably ditch a bit of what I was going to do. I've got a series of slides that provide information about the data that I think is of useful to lots of you and lots of people in Australia. And I'll flick through them really quickly at the end, but I think we can make them available through the association. What we will do is have a bit of a commentary, I think, about some of the work and the issues that were raised this morning, because I think it's really useful to get an idea that really smart data, useful data, is only helpful if there's context. And looking at the Australian context is one of the things that's critical for the Institute of Health and Welfare. And our role is to provide context to those statistics. So the first thing I do is build on the information provided by others and a comment to one of the questions, the issue of the fear of data. I think fear of data, it's a good comment to make, but I think the number one thing is data actually normally is inconvenient data. When it's evidence and when it's the wrong evidence, it becomes inconvenient. And that's the delight I have in leading an organisation that's independent, that we get the opportunity to put out the facts, the data and some context on issues that are normally damn inconvenient for a whole lot of people. We have to do it politely and gently a lot of the time, but it is the opportunity to build on a lot of things that we know about various systems and sectors right across social welfare and health in Australia. I was reflecting, it was about 11, 12 years ago that I was actually the head of the Families Division in what was then FRSA. There's probably a reasonable number of people that were around in the organisations back then. So there's a bit of what goes around comes around. I didn't think I'd be coming to have a chat with you about data 11, 12 years ago, but as I close in on retirement, it's like, hey, this is a pretty good thing to be able to do. And to be the CEO of an organisation provides opportunity. And that opportunity is to share and push in some areas. So the reflections I'd make to start with, the first one, I think with Michael and some of the commentary you make, it provokes, meant to provoke, push, make people think differently. And it reminded me, like Tim said, standing here as a white male, sitting down watching Nanette and Hannah Gadsby and squirming in the seat a little bit. And you stop and think about some of the things that you take for granted. And through the information that the Institute puts out, I see a lot of things where we take a lot for granted, we generically, all from our own positions, and some of it's just misunderstanding, some of it's just life rolls on. And I think the thing that I would add, Michael, to your people, power and place is passion. And that's what you brought to the stage this morning. We're talking about the passion you have for what you do and providing a few of those reminders and little key threads that you need to bring. And I think, again, my job, I think, is to bring context to the Australian scene. And so from a data perspective, it's the passion about data and information and evidence that's a key issue for the staff of the Institute of Health and Welfare. The other bit, the liberation side, I feel liberated. I moved to the Institute 3.5 years ago. So I'm now at about 36.5 years in the public service. Not that jaded by the wonderful world of weaving and ducking and diving through the rules and the politics and so on, but certainly liberated from the viewpoint of going to an organisation where you have independence. And I would interact with ministers 2 or 3 times a year. That's pretty cool. I'd write a brief a couple of times a year, and I don't get asked to go to Senate estimates every time. It's once every 2 or 3 and probably about 5 minutes. And if you've never been or heard of a Senate estimates hearing, you get grilled about everything that's being done politically, bureaucratically or otherwise, and you can sit there for hours taking questions. And to only be taken up there for 5 minutes to be asked about an interesting piece of work you did is a pure delight. But the critical thing, you talked about systems. And so my message to you, there'll be some themes and messages through this, is about the systems that we have in Australia. And you look at the different systems, because there is no one system. There's not really a health system or a welfare system. There's a whole series of different systems, and for better or worse, they're all structured in different ways. And so I don't quite get into the design of place, but the design of systems I get, and I know how bad they are. However, I also travel overseas, and I was speaking at an OECD forum in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and Australia is recognised for how good its systems are. So while we'll fight cat and dog domestically, when you're overseas and you look at what else is going on, including up through Scandinavia, which are often held up as being, the epitome of what you could or should be doing, everybody has their own issues, but Australia is seen really well. Where else do you have a welfare system where income support, I won't get into the argument about the level of the payments, is paid to everybody? We have means testing, and we have our assets testing. So the targeting of it actually, people will argue is good or bad. But if you have the age pension in New Zealand, everybody gets it. If you're the Prime Minister, you retire, you get the age pension. Is that the best use of all money? So the thing that, the link back to data is that with means testing and asset testing, you get an enormously rich data set that comes out to understand what is happening in people's lives. The other bit that Tim mentioned about learning not to impose, and that is the danger with data. That people, any institute, any centre for something or other studies, whatever, has a leaning, has a mission in life. The mission in life for the Institute of Health and Welfare is to make data available and to not skew it left or right. We have some deep and meaningful, other people would say boring, discussions about how we should finalise reports and what we should do. But 99% of what we do is made public. It's out there in the public domain, and we try and play a centre line where the data is the data. We look at methodologies, we look at the results, and we give context, and then others will use the data in varying ways. And we can't be beholden to the fact the data will be used in different ways. Somebody will take page 3 and somebody will take page 35, and you'd swear they were different reports. Earlier this year, we put out Australia's Welfare, one of our flagships, and we got really great coverage in The Australian. So there was an editorial, a brief comment at the bottom of the front page, and a double-page spread. Highly unusual for data stuff. And then we got coverage in a whole range of other newspapers and TVs. And you could have thought it was 2 different documents. The bits about employment, educational outcomes and so on were all in one set of media. and the issue about loneliness and disadvantage, we're all in another set of media. Our job is to put the data out there, but the other thing that our job entails is providing commentary about what's missing, where the data is missing. There is big data, there's scads of data all over the place, but there are also places where data is missing. And part of the job for all of us is to work out what's needed and what's useful, which is back to Tim's point about if you're collecting data that isn't being used by anyone, work out a way to stop it so that we don't clutter up what's useful versus what's just available. The other thing I mentioned in relation to Australia, the 22,000 kids in the survey that Tim mentioned. So in Australia, we do various pieces of work and we look at data that involve millions of kids. We grab entire data sets, so it's not a sample size. But there are survey data. If you're from Victoria, you probably know about Gen V and the work being done around Gen V. So a hugely significant long-term piece of work that will follow people through data sets for ages. South Australia has the children's data sets being done through the university over there. New South Wales has the first 2,000 days, I think it is. Their Futures Matters, and other states have theirs. So we do actually have a lot of this stuff. What we're not good at is telling each other about it, talking about the information that's available. So what I will say as a plea to all of you, at the end of it, go onto our website, find the comms team, and if you want to go in via email, you can link up and get email alerts about our reports. We do 180 plus reports a year, from the flagships to the domestic violence report that hopefully some of you would have looked at in the last couple of years. But again, that was a gap in the data. It hadn't been done before, of bringing the data together in a compendium. So it was trying to provide it in one source as something for anybody to use, whether they're researchers, service providers, policymakers. But accessibility of data is one of the key issues that undermines what we can do as a true value add. Not necessarily everybody gets access to the data and understands about the data. So capability is a huge issue, whether it's in the community, in the sector, for individuals, whether it's somebody doing a PhD and being able to get access to data, but the cost of accessing that data is so ridiculously prohibitive that they can't do it. That doesn't help build understanding. It doesn't help build capability. So I thought from all of the threads from Michael and Tim, the element that came, I think, was you've got to have wisdom of individuals. Each of you as self and using yourself, I think, is a particularly strong thing to remind everybody about, that there's always somebody else who could do something, whether you use that as an excuse or maybe it's valid sometimes. But when you come to data, you've got to be structured in a way where you think about the information, think about the evidence, think about how you might be skewing it. We all like reading elements of information, be they newspaper reports, whether it's just clickbait, sitting on a device, about you follow stuff through because you believe in that sort of thing. But you don't necessarily see the other side to the story. Look for the evidence and look for the data, because you can better argue what it is that you want to achieve and what you want to do if you get the full context. And data builds the evidence base, provides you the context, and Australia is actually one of the leading countries for availability of data and information in the area of social policy, social services and health. So when we go overseas, we're asked about how we are doing certain things. What is it that we're doing in relation to a particular approach? What's happening with data linkage? What's the approach about governance arrangements? And now, anybody who's tried to get data out of the Commonwealth Government, us included, has probably given a few years of their life. It's a test and it's a challenge, but part of the reason is because of governance. Part of it is we need to change the culture about how to get to yes rather than the answer's no. And that is changing. Even being asked to speak about data wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. The world moves on and the conversation now is allowed to happen, and people that like data, it's not in the back corner of the room and you'd be running a parallel session there and there might be 3 people turn up and sneak in the back door. It's actually an open conversation, but still often begrudging about the accessibility of data. So, and they're dead right about other industries are smarter. The community sector and broadly the not-for-profit, a lot of the data is used to make sure that performance is managed at the end of measuring performance. It's not used to help provide the service in the first place. And what I'd say to you is a plea. I'm jumping to the end of my presentation, but the bigger players, the Institute is an organisation where 40% of our money comes from appropriation, the other 60% from projects. And what we would like to do is engage with, and I accept it needs to be a coalition, and it needs collaboration, but if a larger enough group of organisations got together and asked the questions of what data could be found in the 100+ major data sets that we collect, but what would be of interest from a sector viewpoint, and not just your world, because the other thing I'll talk about is how everything is interlinked. It doesn't sit on its own. It's the social determinants of everything. It's not social determinants of health feeding just into health. Everything is interlinked. Better decisions through better data. One of the things is you have to think what you need. What are the questions you want answered? Because the biggest issue that often happens in relation to looking at data, if people think that there's some miracle that's going to happen when they ask for some data, but the miracle comes in working out what the right question is in the first place, of what's important to know about, and then you get into the data. The other thing is that people will often ask for, we need to link some data together, and trust me, I love linked data, and I'll talk a bit about it, but the starting point is you'll be amazed at what's in data sets without having to link them in the first place. Don't put yourself through the torture of seeking ethics committee approvals, governance approvals, the data owners' approvals, and so on for a linkage, if in the first place there might be something that can be answered from within an extract of a data set. So, number one lesson in data, you've got to be able to ask the right question in the first place. No big surprises here. Everybody's seen The Matrix, that's from The Matrix, but data involves numbers, but it's evidence. And the point made before by Tim about the value proposition of knowledge and wisdom is in all of you gets combined with the evidence. It doesn't sit by itself. And the issue that you need to look at is, but what's the evidence you're building? Most of the time I've found that the data will back up what you know. Occasionally it might find something different, but it's not as though that we'll throw some data up and you'll go, wow, I never knew that. It'll be, well, we've known that for years. But you need evidence. If you're going to argue with the government for resources, go figure, then you need to have the evidence about what works, what doesn't work. You need to get the evidence to back up, just like government departments have to argue for funding through the Department of Finance. The only way you can do that is by arguing more and more with evidence base. And sure, every now and then a social worker anecdote gets thrown in, added to it, and that adds colour and movement. And occasionally a social worker story will actually win the day without any evidence. It happens both ways. But the real power is when you have your wisdom, your knowledge, tied in with the evidence base. I guess that was the thick data bit. The next one, of course, it's all about the people. You can't look at data as just the numbers because everything is about a story, everything has context. So good quality data supports the decision making, but it can't force a good decision. So our vision statement for the Institute is about stronger evidence, better decisions, improved health and welfare. All we can do is provide the first bit. Build, reinforce, gather other data, provide better context, talk with stakeholders and understand what the meaning is, and try and build the evidence base. And again, keep it neutral. It's a statement of fact using numbers, but it's about people, and it's adding the context to make sure there's an understanding about how things work through. So you've got to look at what's in it for you. Any data, any evidence, any information that you want, it's got to be used in a way, from our perspective, with strategic data. We don't do real time, we don't do performance information on a day by day. We provide that point in time statement of fact about where Australia is with certain different data sets. In terms of people and who are the people, my number is 25 million. The Australian population. If you talk about all health and non-health, social policy, social service delivery in Australia, it's every Australian. There are very few exceptions, and particularly when you talk about aged care, and you look at the Royal Commission that's going on just now, and the push for data about the elder Australians is huge, and the data's crap. But it's there, it just hasn't been used, it hasn't been put together. And the Royal Commissioner has made some comments about that in terms of, well, why not? Just last week, we put out some data about use of psychotic drugs in aged care facilities and just how high it is compared to the World Health Organization. I should know numbers, but I'm not a numbers person. I'm an interpreter for lots of very smart people in my organisation that do numbers well. But we were 4 or 5 times over the World Health Organization recommended average annual use of drugs. So you can get that from the data, but the Royal Commission already knew it, because they'd had all of the stories, they'd had the information that had come through the hearings, and they were able to get that already, but then we can back up those stories with, here are the numbers. What's the Institute? We sit between the Commonwealth and the jurisdictions. We are a Commonwealth body, and we sit between the Commonwealth and the jurisdictions. We get accepted, I think, in the main by the states and territories as being safe, because when we get data on various things, we don't hand it over to anyone else unless they agree. So we have a lot of information that could cause, back to data that might be inconvenient, could cause a lot of inconvenience. But our job is to bring it together and present it in a way that everyone agrees, but all the time nudging the line about what it is that we're allowed to do. Whether it's juvenile justice, hospital numbers, whatever it might be, that's the job. And if we're not close enough to the line where there's a bit of abrasion or a bit of questioning, then we haven't pushed hard enough. But we've also got to be sensible. We're still a Commonwealth body, and our job is to follow the remit under our legislation. So, and who do we work for? Individuals, communities, and governments, but governments plural. We are very, very careful about what we do has to be commentary that's balanced between the Commonwealth and the states. As you can imagine, hospital funding, health expenditure, any information in those areas. When we put out information on juvenile justice, child protection, out-of-home care, we're very careful that we work through with the owners of the policies and the services, and most of all the data itself. So, one little data tells stories. If you, and many of you would have a child who might be in the focus of your service, we, the system, or systems, would know that that child has 2 parents. We would know that that child has one parent who's on DSP and one who's on Newstart. We would know when that child was born. We would know when the family tax benefit was starting to be paid to that family. We would know at certain points whether she'd had her immunisation and whether or not she was going to school, possibly. Education's always one of those areas where access to data and linking it is really difficult. If she was hospitalised, we would know about it. The system, it's not all brought together, so no, there is no all-encompassing we actually know, but we, the data sets of the country, know all of this stuff, and it's there. So if she turns 16 and she has a child herself, we know that that's happened because she'd be very quickly off to make sure she got payment. It would have been the baby bonus some years ago, but certainly FTB. We would know if she partnered or repartnered, depending on whether she tells Centrelink, and that depends on whether it helps the money go up or down. We know that. But in general, the system knows. When her child turns 6 years old, we know, and we know she needs to look for work. If she's the victim of domestic violence and she tells the system, she can get an exemption for 13 weeks, and the system knows that there's been domestic violence. But that system is not the domestic violence system. If her child had to go into out-of-home care for a while, the system knows, because in the system we identify whether or not the person receiving the money is the primary carer, is the parent, a kinship carer, or a foster carer. So the system knows. And that's all really important, because as those bits get put together, you get to know the person, whether it's the individual or it's 1,000 young teenage parents and their stories and the data, but you know what the cohort looks like. You understand issues relating to that individual. You can think about services that could be done differently. And the example I'll give, if her child had been in foster care, you can look at the data from the Commonwealth system and see that somebody's been in foster care, and you can see where are they when they're 25 years old. And we've done that work. We know that a bit over 40% of people when they're 25 years old are on welfare. Now, a lot will be students and other, but if you've been in the foster system, if they've been through the foster system, 40% or just over. But if they've had half a dozen carers, so they've been through 6 homes, which is always one of the big challenges about permanency versus movement and so on, it goes up to over 80% likelihood of being on welfare when you're at age 25. Now, you probably all know that in general, but the numbers are in there. And then you can look through and say, well, what about if you've had 2 placements, 3 placements, 4? And you can see from the data, and you could start questioning, well, what about if they were a large family? What if they were the only child in the family? What if there were natural children in the family versus a foster child in the family? All those elements to understand. And it's not to use for recriminations, it's to understand what is different. But we do a lot of things blindly when we talk about what policies to change, because we do some of it based on instinct and some of it just by reaction. So the views of the individual are critical. Now, Tim stole my thunder, and I'm wondering, because I've already banged on for a fair bit, haven't I? I've got 15 to go. All the data stuff I will zip through. I'll go to a couple of these. If you could go to Menti. So it's the same thing, menti.com. The code is 3 digits, but I'm going to be a little bit crueler because I'm going to ask you if you know anything. And in part, it's going to be about your world after coffee. So, and we won't, it'll take a while for the first one, so I realise that. So this one was a bit, this was the training one while people get into the system. And you wouldn't believe how badly you get criticised when you're overseas, because I'm in the growing number that it's barista or nothing. And the shoe leather I waste walking around Toronto a few weeks ago, finding somewhere that wasn't Starbucks, because I don't accept that that's barista coffee. And certainly not Tim Hortons, which is just disgusting. Anyway, so I'm a coffee snob, and I proudly say that. And the Canadians asked whether I brought a staff member who was a barista just to help out going along. So I think you get the gist that. I don't know what you did at morning tea though. I think the queue was pretty long. So look, we might jump to the next one because hopefully most people are in, because the next one is a question. What ways do you commonly source data? And the other might also go for, no, I don't. So, So we've got some work to do at the Institute. Okay, we might jump to the next one. And one of these ones coming up, I'll skip over because the minister gave it away earlier on. So well done, the majority, 2.8 million. If we can jump to the, if we go through, we'll jump to the next one. The minister said this morning 45,800. We'll do this one just as the last one. I think we've got the flow of it. The answer from the prevalence survey was 1 in 2. So I think if you also, though, take into account, do you hear that does everybody tell that there's been domestic violence? So, and the interesting thing as well is that for men, it's that 68% of men never sought advice. And that's one of the things that for the Institute, our role is to provide the information, male and female, everything. It's about the data of family domestic sexual violence. So look, the high-speed run-through. As I said, don't worry too much about the data ones, but I did have a look at the fostering innovation and collaboration and your strategic theme for the conference, and that data is a subject area in there. But the key message that I wanted is that we have about 75 areas that we look at. So a conversation across social policy at the Institute covers foster care, juvenile justice, health, diabetes, obesity, Indigenous issues, family and domestic violence, aged care, disability. We do burden of disease. We can cross burden of disease into expenditure now, and we can start looking at the impacts on children of burden of disease and mental health related issues. We do the mental health work for the National Mental Health Commission and 30% of the Productivity Commission. We support the development of the Atlas of Health with 30% of their data. All of that information comes with it's about 7 domains that look at people. The work you do crosses all of these. As you talk to individuals that you are trying to help, it's the different domains. And so we talk about the social determinants of everything. It hasn't really been taken up as a slogan, but we'll get there if I keep on banging on enough. We tried to have that set as the title for the forum in Paris, but you can imagine Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, social determinants of everything was not going to cut it. But I used the slide when I spoke, but they didn't call it. It was just social data for better social policy, so that was close enough. So the sorts of things that you can do is blow out a whole lot of information, and I said all of these will be available to understand what's happening in housing, what's happening in education, and now in the employment world. So all of these areas, information is available and give you broader context, and a lot of it is publicly available. So not just through us, through the Institute of Family Studies, through various universities, in state-based institutions, this information is around that can give you information that can help broaden the context for the services you deliver and the context for how you interact with those other services. And so as I go through all of those, there's a whole range of other data sets that as I said, I'd prepared these earlier, but because it was a longer presentation. But Compendium reporting in mid-December, we'll have a first compendium on children that we'll put out, which brings data together from dozens of different sources. The last one was done in 2012. So with the support of the Department of Social Services, we've been funded to bring this together again. But there are other compendiums that we do, which are trying to provide one-stop shops of information, a lot of which you might know is available elsewhere. Linkage is critical in terms of looking at the kind of linkage work that you might be able to do across different areas of social welfare. Don't just rely on let's look at health or let's look at education, or it's people's pathways through the multiple systems that you need the evidence base on, because the solution to their problem doesn't necessarily sit in the area in which the problem is surfaced. And you all would know that, but our systems don't talk to each other. But we are getting better and better all the time at doing the linkage of the data to provide that evidence base. Child protection and youth justice, a particular one that we looked at, which is available. Little bits that are happening in the education area, but that's one for us where we would really like to enter into where education, because when you talk social determinants of everything, the role of education we know is so key, and we need to make sure that we can step forward and actually get a better understanding of where we can make those connections and understand the pathways that people are taking. Aged care, I mentioned this, but GP visits, it wasn't just the antipsychotic drugs, but it's GP visits, because you can look at the people in residential aged care, you can link them to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, you can link them to the hospital scheme, and you can link them into the MBS. All that data is there, it just hadn't been linked before, so you can actually see what is going on. And not that we report on this, but yes, you can identify which aged care service they come from. So we don't do evaluation and we don't do compliance, because as soon as we say nasty things about anybody, they stop giving us the data. So our job is to get the evidence out there and allow others to look at the data based on whatever their role and function might be. So specialist homelessness and drug and alcohol, no surprises. Even at some of the larger issues, the suicide monitoring for the Defence Force personnel is key, and has opened up a whole discussion around the health services provided to veterans. And the last one, enduring data sets as national assets. Bringing together these data sets, de-identifying them and bringing them together so that you understand what's going on. We were funded a few months ago to start building a national disability data asset that's going to be an interesting challenge, but critical with the Royal Commission and with the NDIS. NDIS only funds 10% of people with disability. So there's a lot of people with disability and we need to understand their pathways. And then the where to next. So it's really just a question for all of you. Back to the starting point of where do you sit in the scheme of using evidence? What do you think the capacity is of you, your organisation, the sector, to challenge by using evidence? What could you bring together, or what do you need from other organisations, whether it's us or somebody else? But also, I suppose, an issue around information and moving the sector forward. What might be the opportunities and the challenges? And I'll leave it there. There's always more to be said about data and information, but the context is really, I think, very much an issue for any industry, any sector, about there is more there than you think, the possibilities are greater than you think, and the understanding it will bring are probably greater than you think. It's just a matter of going back and asking that first set of correct questions to really inform yourselves and find out what's available in your own backyard, in your own organisation, or from elsewhere, to be better informed to deliver for whatever your number is of the people it is that you're supporting. Thank you.
Now, we do still have around 2 or 3 minutes left for questions before we wrap up. So can I ask, we have some roving microphones, if anyone has some questions for Barry.
That was a very good presentation, so thanks very much, Barry. My question was in relation to what the Institute collects, and you mentioned what are the sorts of things that might move the sector forward. I come from the specialist mental health sector, and one of the things that was identified at a recent conference there was that the data that's collected by the Institute for Health and Welfare is focused a lot around the hospital system and not on the community-based mental health system, meaning community managed not-for-profits. So my question is really about what are the mechanisms to change the way in which data is collected for the purposes of advocacy for the sector and for clients who use and people who use the sector?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Anything that's outside of the big formal systems is just harder to collect and harder to bring together. So we're working on primary health care, not just as GPs, but allied health professionals, other specialists, to try and start building a national primary health care data asset to get away from the focus on mainstream, the hospitals and MBS, PBS, because that's where the big data sets are. But equally, advocacy about what can be found or what could be included in data coming from other directions, we're always welcome to receive input, because the best ideas come from out there where people see the gaps far more than we might see them ourselves. So be more than happy to respond to an email and ask the team. Again, they're the experts, so I'd ask them. I wouldn't try and answer myself. But it's a really good point about where you might see gaps and what you could look at that could be helpful. And a really good example is national homelessness data. We run the collection for 1,500 services, and I think it's about 70% of those services are almost family and domestic violence services as well. So we have this homelessness collection, but we have no collection on family and domestic violence for various reasons. The sensitivities, obviously, and location information is really a major issue. So we get that, but there are opportunities where there's already systems built and they all use the very similar software. So there are opportunities there just to be, I think, just a bit of pushing and nudging, the odd cricket bat, but it takes a lot to nudge people forward.
Thanks, Barry, for an excellent presentation. My question is just to ask you to speculate on when we might have the functionality to have accessible, community-linked and integrated community data dashboards, because that could be an extremely powerful mechanism for really understanding the sense of place. I don't underestimate the privacy issues, but there are examples around the country of where that's been done, focused on a specific part of the problem.
Yep.
But, I think social determinants of everything will advance when you've got that sort of functionality available to services.
Yeah. Look, I think the functionality is there. Perhaps not just the decision to actually bring it together and put it out as in a community structure. There'd be a debate around what do we mean, what level of geography. As I say, some sensitivities with big data sets, that's fine. So if it was MBS, so you're looking at the health system, you've got so many people that you can go down to a low level of geography, but some other data sets are really small, so you cannot go down to community. But we're developing some stuff, working with the Department of Health in relation to Indigenous regions around the health factors, because the data's stronger there, that we hope would then be able to be presented at community or region level and give people access to understand what's going on in their area. And so all the technology is there, and some of our software that we now use on our website allows you to drill in and look at your local area. Often just now it's goes down to state level, primary health network level, and then in some areas we go below. But again, health, it happens far more. There's just not a, if you like, a joined up push from the broader community sector to say, well, what about us? But because juvenile justice sits here and out of home care sits there, there's not a joined up view. And it also, to be blunt, involves 3 or 4 or 5 different ministers in every jurisdiction, whereas with health, there's health. And it's probably, if you want to be blunt about biggest barriers, it's the fact that you all deal with this more than I, but it's multiple departments, multiple ministers to cross the tangle of social determinants, whereas health is health. So it's far more progressed. We're putting up soon on a website the Australia's Health Performance Framework with its first set of indicators, and then we'll progressively add to those. So it will be there. I can't see in my career that we'll have one on the welfare side. But I'd love to be the one that started something that somebody else will get the benefit of in 5 or 6 years' time, perhaps.
Friends, I know that we've had an action-packed day and we are now behind time, but it well worthwhile, I'd suggest. So can I ask you all to join me in thanking Barry for his presentation today?
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Much appreciated.